Anyway, Steve, I would like to start with a story, a war story, because Joe Connolly asked me, geez, I hope he talks about the future of journalism, and I think you fulfilled that in spades. But I want to know about a war story. You've been holding out on who really killed Zia L. Hawk. And so I hope you tell us, or at least what it was like to be there. And I'll combine two questions. In one, you mentioned the word algorithm. If you started reporting ghost wars now, how different would your work be?
Great. So, yeah, I mean, by accident of assignment at the Washington Post, I started there as a reporter in 1985 and wanted to be a foreign correspondent. And the way the Post worked at that time, you really couldn't pick where you went. You had to go to the foreign staff and say, I'll go wherever you send me. And that's weeded people out who were only interested in Paris. And there was a lot of people wanted to get on the staff at that time. And so when I was selected, I was sent to India, really kind of at the last minute, even though I had two very young children. Fortunately, my wife was very adventurous. So I covered Pakistan and Afghanistan, and that's where a lot of this work in my life comes from. It was a great accidental assignment. But I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan and in Pakistan working on the jihad in the 80s and the early 90s and the kind of collapse of the resistance into this fratricidal civil war and the rise of the Islamists, and with a guy named Steve Levine, who's still around and was at the Wall Street Journal for a long time. We wrote at the Post our first story about Osama bin Laden in 1993. So my concentration on this, when 9/11 happened, I mean, it was just, a kind of shock of a different sort, because I knew who all these people were and where they had come from, and I never imagined that they would come, literally crashing into the center of American life. So that's where that work came from. I mean, I used to love working in Pakistan. I still do, but it's harder than it used to be. Post Danny Pearl was sort of a wake-up call for a generation of us who'd worked on the streets there. It used to be a very easy place to run around in the streets, and when Zia al-Haq, who was the great Pakistani military leader, was killed, I went and did this big investigative reporting thing, driving onto army bases without an invitation and doing things you wouldn't do now. I think he was actually killed by a really bad Lockheed manufactured equipment in his plane, not by any individual, but they basically went through the mystery of the Oriental Express and accused everybody else in the world before they got around to the technical problem. I'll be very interested to see what happens if we ever learn what brought down MH360, I guess it is. The second question is really on my mind because I'm actually working now on a book, a second volume of Ghost Wars. So Ghost Wars was this narrative history of the antecedents of 9/11 as it was located in failures of or practices of American foreign policy intelligence covert operations from the time of the Soviet invasion until September 10th. So the book kind of ends on September 10th, 2001. And so I'm now slowly, in between everything else, working on a second volume that would come up through this year. And I've been thinking a lot about how to take my own advice, basically, which is, what is the role of data? What role can it play? I wish I were more advanced as a practitioner. I'd like to take a year off and just go back to school. I'm not bad at investigative reporting of the traditional type, using public records, and a lot of that has now become digital, and I've gotten reasonably good at using digital tools in the ways that I already knew how to use analog tools, so public records, real estate, civil litigation, criminal litigation, running names, checking people's backgrounds. The real opportunity in a war, though, that social scientists and historians will take up, and I probably won't get to it in a leading way, but I'm going to try to do some of this in the project, is to basically step back from the whole 12-year trajectory of a conflict like that and say, what would the data show us that we wouldn't otherwise see? And then figure out how to scrape that together and make a human story out of it. And there are candidates. I know this history very well. There are candidates for that, but I almost need a data scientist as a partner to do it, because I need to be able to figure out, I can say what I think matters in the history, and I need someone on the other side of the equation to say what's powerful, what's possible with the data science and computational science itself. And that kind of, even the fact that I'm struggling with that has actually helped me think about what it is we should be doing in the classrooms, because we're probably at a stage where you need to bring people together to collaborate around these problems with strength equal on both sides. Because if you let the data scientists overwhelm you, they'll just make pretty maps, I tell you. I mean, they love illustration and visualization, you know. If you want them to take their skills and drive it toward a public problem, it's not like they don't have ideas about what matters in society. Of course they do, but they don't have the 20 years of experience of knowing where the big investigative insights come from to be drawn. So you really need a partnership of equal confidence. And that means the journalists have to have the courage to talk to the scientists about their own work. And it doesn't mean they have to be able to do the coding, but they can't be intimidated. Too often it seems to me that in the early collaborations, it's the hackers that overwhelm the journalists. And so figuring out how to reset that balance is an important challenge.
Now, Tony Guida is roaming the room here with a mic for questions, but I'm going to ask one more. How do you organize your thoughts to get all this work done?
Well, it's not demonstrated that I've been able to figure out how to do it at Columbia yet, but I've done this before at the Washington Post when I was managing editor for 6 years. I wrote Ghost Wars while I was managing editor, so that was 800 people, $120 million a year budget, and 7 days a week with a bat phone next to my bed that rang every time a plane crashed. So I figured that conditioned me to a level of grinding hard work that I feel now has served me well in my old age. I mean, basically, you know, as Woodward says in answer to similar questions, I'm just a humorless workaholic. I'm just a humorless workaholic. That's the answer.
Okay, Tony, go ahead. Ralph's got a question there.
Steve, how concerned are you with the sequel to the book that the NSA will know who all your sources are? And are you studying encryption as a way of protecting your reporting now?
Yeah, I am concerned, and not even so much just the NSA, but also the Chinese and the Pakistanis and everyone else, because basically one of the things we're working on at the Tao Center at Columbia, the Tao Center for Digital Journalism, we have some research projects, and one of them is to try to define in the world that Snowden has described for us what professional hygiene for working reporters actually requires. You know, I think in our analog age, we could have, I don't remember reading books exactly devoted to that form of the question, but we all knew what it was. I mean, for example, you didn't talk about the name of your confidential source in the newsroom. You didn't share it with colleagues gratuitously, even if you were feeling excited about your achievements, because, you know, enough litigation had proved that that testimony could be reached, and it actually broke the claim that the privilege that your institution could otherwise reside under if you didn't practice good hygiene in the way that you personally managed information of that type. And of course, there are many other examples from our era. These days, good hygiene has to, for example, if you really want to be serious about it, if you travel outside the United States, basically anywhere, but especially when I go to a place like Pakistan or if I go to a conference in China, you have to go buy a new computer, perfectly clean, and keep the wireless function off the whole time you're there. You just have to take it because anything else you do exposes all of your information, not just then, but when you get back. Yeah, you can take a lesser form of hygiene, come back, change all your passwords, but you know, if you're really carrying around like stuff that I'm carrying around with this Afghan war book, you know, you can't do that. You're giving it up. And encryption is a very interesting problem of ordinary practice that I don't feel satisfied about, and I'll be interested to see what my colleagues' work produces. One of the problems, of course, you create an enormous amount of friction between you and your sources if you use encryption routinely, and that in itself you know, creates enormous costs to your practice. And then it's not clear from Snowden whether the encryption that we would rely on works. You know, you could be getting the worst of both worlds, a phony security that when somebody wants to crack it, they can. Now, certain people will tell you that if you have a high level of encryption, especially from the very best open source, that it's hard enough to crack that you end up creating a deterrent, and people just decide it's not worth it. Too many hours. It's not that it can't be done, it's just too hard. So, there are people who believe very strongly that good hygiene does involve encryption, but even if we could define a practice that we agreed was the best synthesis of the costs and benefits of encryption, and we tried to, go out and deliver it into working newsrooms around the country. I mean, the Orlando Sentinel or the TV station in Sacramento that's working on a police case where their tapes may end up subpoenaed. I mean, everyone would have to somehow adapt to this way of communicating, and I just don't know how we get from here to there quite yet. It's a really hard problem. It's a problem for research as well as discussion.
Steve, two Snowden questions. Number one, what's the lasting impact of what he's done? And number two, if you were president, would you let him come back and pardon him?
Well, it's much easier for me to answer the first question. He has, the journalists who worked with him, I should say, and he indirectly, have exposed a series of practices that were profoundly at odds with the public claims that were being made by our government about its compliance with FISA and related statutes. The president repeatedly says that there's been no exposure of unlawful activity, but that's a very self-rewarding syllogism. I mean, it's a very narrowly drawn assertion. There is no question that what has been described in the Post and the Guardian includes findings by, again and again, by inspectors general and internal investigators at NSA of routine breaks from compliance and the law. And we already knew from the New York Times' reporting in 2000 and whenever it was, 4 or 5, that a recent president was willing to bend the law even in the face of advice that he was doing so in order to approve warrantless wiretapping. I don't think there can be reasonable doubt, this is just my opinion, about the public interest benefits of these disclosures. The structure of NSA, its operating assumptions, the failures of the FISA court, which has been a rubber stamp since the 70s, but the specific granular nature of those failures, the audacious interference with private communication networks by globalized corporations whose credibility went to the heart of the U.S. internet economy's claims to the rest of the world that we were a reliable governor of everyone else's communications. I mean, these are really enduring matters of public interest. These are not marginal questions. These are fundamental to the health of American democracy and the American economy, in my opinion. I'm going to pass on the clemency question. I'm not the President of the United States. I don't want to be, and I'm not sure that I have a view about that.
Do you think the internet has possibly exposed readers to simply too many sources of information that they just can't cope with it? And also, has the internet facilitated the spread of false information?
There's no question that the internet has facilitated the spread of false information. The Reddit example is only one. I guess I stop on the words too much because that has a kind of value judgment in it that I respect and might even endorse, but which stops me because the reverse of the drowning problem is the access. The information that is available to everyone in the world now at their fingertips to retrieve, to search and retrieve. If you have a trained intelligence, to use Joseph Pulitzer's phrase, to be able to distinguish, the more credible from the less credible sources of information, your ability to learn, to live in knowledge, whether it's about your own health or your family's health or a response to a medical emergency, in your own home in rural Brazil or low-income housing project in the United States. The potential of having all of the world's information accessible to all of the world's people to advance our health and collective kind of security and prosperity is awesome. It really is awesome. And I feel it in my practice as a journalist. I mean, the things that I can do sitting at my desk to move along are, really remarkable. One of the problems, because I was writing something about Fox News recently, and I decided to see if I could say something fresh. I went and I read, I'm not sure I got there, but one of the exercises I went through before I gave up on it was I went and read all of the social science experiments and cognitive science experiments that had been published in the academic literature that mentioned Fox News. So I printed them all out and just sat with them for a couple of days. And I ended up not using any of this because it left me just depressed about social science, actually. But one of the things that is clearly established is that we humans have a bias to hear information that reinforces our biases. It makes us, it's part of our emotional, our makeup. It's our genetic makeup. We like to cluster around affirmation. And so in the information ecology, if you open up the channels and you make information infinite, one of the natural human impulses in response is to gravitate to the affirming information. And that's not probably good for public decision making. Now, you could say, well, it all adds up because the people who believe their own facts all get into the square and throw bricks at each other, but we see that politics now in front of us, and it's not deliberative. It is based on opposing convictions that have a kind of false empiricism about them, that there's really no way to challenge. So, particularly for our generation that lived in the era of the kind of public square, we don't need to romanticize it. It had its flaws. It was a kind of an accident of history in a lot of ways. But there is an accountability to government and to public decision-making that occurs when everyone is having the same conversation. And even, as a traveler, the BBC is a very flawed institution. It would be impossible to create something like that in the United States. But that's a nation of 70 million people that does have a common conversation, sometimes for worse, but mostly for better. And there is an independent press and lots of other things going on besides this public square. We had that public square to a greater extent than we do now, and I think its loss. My own view is that its loss is detrimental.
Yeah, since I left broadcasting, I've been teaching television reporting at NYU, where the journalism students are 70% female. Some of my classes are 100% female. My question is, why do you think the men have opted out? And since men continue to run all the media organizations, what's going to happen to all these women? And do you discuss that?
It's a great question. It's a great question. I mean, 60% of our students are women too, and I don't know why. I assume it's because basically women are succeeding in higher education in much greater percentages than men across the board, and that once you release them from the kind of tyranny of gender balance admissions at the undergraduate level, that they're free to choose, their pathways into graduate school, that for whatever reasons, journalism has attracted an even higher percentage than you see in the kind of 55-45 undergraduate split. For us, it's not that dramatic. It goes from roughly, there's a 55-45 split in undergraduate, depending on how you define the universe. And when you come forward to graduate school, in our case, it goes to 60%. Now, it may also be that women of a certain generation were discouraged systematically through bias and other selection until recently to stay out of engineering and hard sciences, and maybe we're seeing some kind of sort of unintended consequence of that. But I know that it's changing very rapidly in both the undergraduate and graduate settings right now. The rise of engineering and math and science education across gender is the story of our kind of educational times. And so this feels like a snapshot, and I don't know whether to trust its stability. I assume that all these great women who were graduating, and they are really stars. I mean, the degree of energy and leadership that they exhibit gives me great faith that they will get into these institutions and change them for the better.
I just recently read your review of the Roger Ailes biography in the New York Review of Books.
That's what I was talking about.
I know. And I want to know whether you think Roger Ailes has been good or bad for journalism, and where do you think Fox News will be in 5 years?
Well, you know, part of the point of that essay was to depersonalize the story of Fox News, because really, my hypothesis, as I'm sure you remember, is that instead of asking the question in the form of, you know, is Roger Ailes himself good or bad for journalism, you have to I think you have to see the rise of Fox News as a story of the adaptation to the 500-channel cable television universe of the enduring 70-year-old tradition of demagogic populist right talk radio. That, you know, the kind of paradigm of Fox News is that the straight news function was certainly at the beginning more or less programmed from dawn till 5 o'clock, and then you turned the primetime hours over to, you know, basically got people from talk radio who had already demonstrated the power, you know, going back to Father Coughlin in the 1930s, of this sort of talk and the audience that would be attracted to it. And in America, it's a very particular tradition. It has included the left at times, but it's mostly been a center-right heartland model. And so, you know, Ailes gets all this credit for inventing the idea of Fox News's place in our political culture, but part of my hypothesis is that if he hadn't done it, someone else would have seen the opportunity to basically replicate right-wing talk radio on cable news the way people saw the opportunity for the Food Channel or ESPN or, you know, the Animal Planet and all the rest. I mean, when you open up the channels, you basically have to niche program, and this is one of the proven niches that has made a ton of money. I think that where Fox News will be in 5 years is a really interesting question, because he has had a personal power and imprint as a programmer and as a kind of entertainment figure around Fox News that has only increased as the years have passed. And I don't know whether it's 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, but there's going to have to be a redefinition of Fox News after Roger Ailes. And there are some very clear intersections. The Republican Party has an opinion about where it wants Fox News to go, and it wants it to come back to the center. It wants to program to win national elections again, which means programming in a way that doesn't gratuitously exclude America's, you know, increasingly diverse society from its viewership. So how that will be resolved it's also going to be a post-Rupert Murdoch company at some point. And so, again, I don't think that's 5 years, but 20 years from now, this channel is going to endure, because populist talk has been around for 100 years, and it makes money, and it will always make money, and it will make people mad, and it will make money while it makes people mad. And Fox has established a place that will be hard for anyone else to occupy for a while, assuming cable remains stable. But I think there's the character of that, what you see, the faces you see, the tones you see, the way that those blocks of time are programmed, that could change very rapidly about 10 years from now.
Got time for one more question.
This is about metadata and foreign correspondence. I was the Time Bureau chief in Delhi when Afghanistan began in '78, actually. And you say you're going back over all of this. I thought I'd done a pretty good job of figuring out what happened, but I'm sure I'm not the only person. I wrote about it later. Did I understand you correctly to say that you're going back over that whole period and attempting to apply metadata to what happened in Pakistan and Afghanistan, or did I get that wrong? And if so, how?
Well, so I wrote this one book, Ghost Wars, which starts essentially in 1979 and ends in 2001, and I'm at work now on what I think of as a second volume. And 95% of my reporting effort and my preparation to get ready to write the second volume. So the second volume would start in 2001, probably on September 11th, and would end this year, whenever our war in Afghanistan is over, and whatever it is that comes out of this election, which looks like it might not be the catastrophe that a lot of people forecasted. But anyway, that's the ending. I have an ending. It's this year. And the American people have an ending, too. I'm sure they're pleased about that as well. The 95% of what I'll do in the book will be what I always do, which is to try to find people and stories and information that hasn't been discovered and write it in a narrative form and cut it together and make it readable. But the investigative reporter in me kind of wants to answer my own question, which is, are there a couple of shots that you could take? I mean, for example, I don't mind thinking out loud. For better or worse, no one else is going to want to write this book. I promise you. I don't feel the world is clamoring for another Afghanistan book, so I don't feel any competitive threats out there. When I worked on the ExxonMobil book, I tell you, 4 years, the hardest thing I've ever done. I never saw any other reporter in my side view mirror. At about 2.5, 3 years out, I thought, maybe there's a reason for that. So in this case, I like to try to bring. Part of the challenge is not to write a synthesis, not to tell people what they already know, not to tell stories that have been told over again, but to keep delivering fresh, original information inside a book. And so I've been thinking, I know how to do that with sources and dig out stories that haven't been told, but I was trying to think, are there subjects where I could use data science to bring forward some really sharp insights about the war that haven't been captured yet? And so take the narrative of corruption. Contracting, right? So we know that we spent, starting out at 5, 10, 20, 50, eventually $100 billion a year on the war effort. And a lot of that was done in the form of contracts. And because of the US system, a lot of the contracts are published, but they're completely indecipherable because the companies are just, fronts and the principles don't add up. And so is there some way that you could scrape all of that together and really narrate something about the way follow the money? That would be one option. So I'm thinking of about 5 or 6 things like that, and maybe I'll find someone to help me with 1 or 2 of them, just to seed into the book.
I'm looking forward to that book. Before I thank the Dean for an absolutely wonderful talk and discussion, I want to remind you of a couple things. On May 15th, which is a Thursday, we have our annual awards dinner. And I also want to thank our judges who judged this contest last week. Some of them are in the room: Merv Block, Robin Reisig, Jack Dacey, Myron Candell, Wendy Slyke, Ben Petrusky. Who else am I missing here? Somebody. I know there's somebody. Anyway, we had a bunch of judges, and it was all great, and we have some good winners, and I hope you'll be there for that. And then we'll have a lunch in June. Now, God, I hope I haven't lost this. The board recently established a new tradition, which is our way of saying thank you, is to make you a member of the Silurians. Now, where did I put your card? But maybe I'll find it as we sit down. And anyway, thank you very much. It was really terrific.